Hello, I'm Anthony Hughes. Thank you for joining me once again as we explore playback here in Dorico. In the last video, I talked quite a lot about expression maps and what they're used for. Now, we're going to create one for ourselves. Can't wait. Right, so you would start by choosing a virtual instrument that you would like to use with Dorico. This can be any VST3 virtual instrument. To show you how this all works, I'm going to use a violin preset from Spitfire's magnificent BBC Symphony Orchestra library. If you're playing along at home, I'm using the professional version here. Now actually, we have already made a full playback template available for each of the three versions of the BBC SO library that contain all the expression maps you need, and I'll link to those below. But it's a great library to show you how this process works. In Dorico, we need to add a violin player to our project. So in Setup mode, click one of the Add Player buttons at the bottom of the Players panel. This is going to be for a first violin section, so I'll add a section player. Technically, that doesn't matter for the creation of the expression map. However, it will be necessary to make that distinction when we get on to making playback templates later, so good to be in the right mindset. Next, we load the library in play mode. Switch the left zone to the VST and MIDI panel and add a new VST. Browse the list of available instruments to find the one you want to work with. The VST's interface will open, and from there you can load a sound preset. I'll be working with this Violins 1 preset. As you can see, there are a number of different technique sounds that comprise this preset, with some short sounds, spiccato, staccato, and pizzicato, and some long sounds, legato, long, and so on. The expression map will allow Dorico to control which of these technique sounds is used when certain musical markings are placed in your score. In order for the Dorico violin instrument to play back using the BBC SO sound preset, we need to set the routing. Ensure the violin track is selected in play mode, then switch to the track inspector. In this top routing section, use the pop-up control to select the instance of BBC Symphony Orchestra. The plugin loads just one instrument per instance, so the port and channel can be left as they are. Now, the violin staff will play back using our newly loaded sound. You'll notice a control that allows us to set an expression map for the selected track. We won't find the one we need, of course, as we haven't made it yet, but we can still open the dialog here, or we can access it from the library menu. A list of available expression maps is found in the sidebar. We can either create a new expression map from scratch, or we can select an existing one and duplicate it to use as a starting point. Duplicating can be a good idea, especially when you're creating a whole series of expression maps for a playback template that all use the same sound library and have similar characteristics. For the purpose of this demonstration, however, I'll start by creating a new empty expression map. We need to give our expression map a uniquely identifiable name. Let's call it BBC SO Violins. It'll be assigned a unique ID automatically. The other data here is optional. Click the padlock to unlock the fields, and if you like, add some information that might help you identify the map, especially when you're sharing it or if you've made some updates. Some sound libraries record performers in specific spatial positions in order to emulate ensemble arrangements and to help the different instruments' sounds blend nicely. If that's not the case with the library you're working with, then you can apply Dorico's stage template settings and move your players around the live stage. There are options here for how the library approaches the playback of microtonal music and the scope of pitch bends, which is set here in semitone steps. Now we can move on to perhaps the main section of the expression map, switches. You can see it's called bass and add-on switches. A bass switch is a trigger that switches the sound preset to a different technique or articulation. An example of an add-on switch might be for when you want to add something like a vibrato action on top of another technique. Bass switches are the most common case and what we will be looking at in this video. What's more, we'll be looking at bass switches using key switch note actions. I'll explore add-on switches and the other types of note actions in future videos in this series, so do look out for those if you have a library that could utilize them. It's a good idea to start by defining what you want the natural state of the instrument to be. Looking at the BBC SO instrument, there are probably two main contenders here: legato and long. Legato patches simulate a natural transition between two notes, but that comes at the expense of being monophonic, so you can't play chords. I frequently find myself flipping between what I want to be the natural state for an instrument like this. Often it can be dependent on the project itself, but at least, as you'll see, it's easy to edit the expression map if that's the case. Anyway, let's go for the long technique for now. The important information we need is the MIDI note used as the key switch. For some VST instruments, you may need to refer to the documentation for this, though most of the time it should be displayed somewhere on the interface. For the BBC SO library, it's clearly visible here, and in fact, easily editable. Just to add a bit of confusion to the mix, there's more than one standard for defining middle C. It's always MIDI note 60, but often that's described as C4, though it could easily be C3 or even C5. The number denotes the octave. We need to make sure we're going to get the right note, so it's imperative we know which standard the instrument's using. Again, you might need to refer to the documentation for this, but here we can see that this Spitfire instrument is using C4. If we look back at our new expression map, there's a control to set which middle C convention is being used, so set that to match. You can also set this in Dorico's preferences at the top of the general page that will influence things like note names in the key editor and so on. Whatever's set here will be carried through to new expression maps. It doesn't actually change anything anywhere. It's just to make sure we're referring to the same underlying MIDI notes. Okay, so with that confirmed, and knowing that the long technique is triggered by the note C#-1, select natural in the list and add a key switch note action. Then edit the MIDI note to match the C#-1 of our long sound preset. Let's try this out. Press OK to confirm your changes, and with the violin track still selected, set the expression map to our new BBC SO violins. Now, when we press play, the long technique is selected in the VST instrument. Even if we manually choose a different technique when you press play in Dorico or select any note on the violin staff, it immediately switches back to long. Right, let's set up a second switch. We can use the button in the Play Mode Track Inspector to quickly open our expression map. This time, let's add a new bass switch. This shows us the very long list of available playback techniques that we can choose from. Look for the pizzicato technique, and with it selected in the list, press OK. Be aware you can make multiple selections in this dialog, so make sure you have only pizzicato selected. Let's see what the key switch is for pizzicato in BBC SO. It's F#-1. So let's add that as a key switch note action to our pizzicato switch and press OK. To test our new switch, click the Audition button in the action bar for the list of switches. However, let's try it out for real. In write mode, I can open the Playing Techniques panel, find pits in the string section, and click into the score where I would like it to take effect. Play back, and you'll hear the switch from arco to pits. Let's switch back to arco at this point. This time, with the note selected, I'm going to type Shift-P to open the Playing Techniques popover and type arco. The arco playing technique is set up to trigger the natural switch in our expression map. So when the playhead reaches this point, we should now go back to our original long technique. I'll show you how playing techniques can affect expression maps in a couple of videos' time, so keep watching the series. Now, if you watched my previous video on expression maps, you might be thinking I've missed something. Well, that's right. The key switches here are only part of the story. We have the correct techniques from the VST playing back, but we need to think about how the dynamics are controlled. Indeed, If we add some dynamics to this long-held note, nothing happens. If we go back to the Spitfire BBC Symphony Orchestra plugin and look at the pizzicato technique, we can see how note velocity, effectively how hard you're striking the key, dictates the dynamic of the instrument. By the way, I'm using a popular pattern here for on-screen MIDI keyboards, whereby pressing at the top of the key executes a low velocity, and pressing at the bottom of the key sends a high velocity. However, if I try to do the same with the long technique, I always get the same velocity. And that's because for these long-held sounds that can fluctuate their dynamic profile within the extent of a single note, the MIDI control change, or CC1, is used for note dynamics. Bring the slider down, and the dynamic is lower. Push the slider up, and the dynamic increases. And because my MIDI keyboard modulation wheel is set to control MIDI CC1, as is so often the case, I can use it to control the dynamics of this sound. In the expression map, the pizzicato volume dynamic is correctly set to note velocity, because that's the default. Our natural switch, however, needs to be changed to control change 1. Now, when we play back our example, the dynamics take effect. So the next step would be to work through the violin's preset, adding switches to cover as many of the available techniques as you want to be able to access from within Dorico. There's a lot more to cover with expression maps. However, I've been going on long enough for one video, so I suggest I leave it there for today. And I do have a number of videos planned for later in the series that'll cover everything from different switch types and actions, more advanced dynamic examples, overriding playback options, and updating and making fixes to your expression maps. So the last things I wanted to say now were, remember to check the middle C MIDI note convention for the plugin you're using and match Dorico's setting to it. Otherwise, you might end up mapping notes at the incorrect octave. If that has happened, you can use these buttons to modify key switches an octave at a time. Also, remember to set your new expression map for the track or tracks in play mode that you want to use it. It's easy to forget that and then be wondering why it's not working. And in the key editor, the playing techniques lane that can be hidden or shown displays the prevailing switch, and mousing over it will show all the details. So it's a good way to check everything is working as you expect. And the very last but important thing is that the expression map is saved with the project. If you open a different project, it won't be available by default. You can export an expression map from the dialog and then import it into another project. However, much of the time, you'll actually be managing expression maps between projects by way of the larger playback templates that we are inching closer to working with here in this series of videos. So, lots covered here, and I very much hope it's been useful. Please let me know in the comments and click the button if you've enjoyed the video. Thank you. Join me in the next one, where I shall introduce you to the cool brother, percussion maps. I'm Anthony Hughes. Thanks for watching.